would suddenly be hit in the shoulder, the leg, the back, without warning. Arrows punched through padded armor easily at this range, with bodkin points designed specifically for armor penetration. They struck horses carrying supplies, pack animals, anyone and anything in the formations. Men began falling immediately, creating obstacles that other Scots had to step over or maneuver around, further disrupting the advance and breaking formation cohesion. As the Scottish army struggled desperately uphill through exhausting mud and continuous arrow bombardment, the killing accelerated with mathematical precision. At 600 yards, the arrows became significantly more accurate and more deadly as range closed. At 400 yards, bodkin point arrows could penetrate even chainmail and light plate armor worn by Scottish knights. The Scots had no effective answer to the arrow storm. They possessed a few hundred archers of their own, equipped with shorter, less powerful bows, but these were completely outranged by the English longbows and achieved essentially nothing. Scottish commanders desperately urged their men forward, shouting that the only possible escape from the arrows was to reach the English defensive lines and engage in close combat, where archery became useless. But reaching the English lines required advancing 800 yards uphill through knee-deep mud under absolutely continuous bombardment. It took perhaps 30 to 40 minutes for the Scottish schiltrons to cover that killing distance, and every single second of those minutes, arrows fell without pause. Contemporary sources describe the sound as like hail on a roof, a continuous rain of death that never stopped. Scottish soldiers couldn't run because of the sucking mud and the weight of their equipment and armor. They couldn't break formation because that meant being isolated and killed individually. They couldn't retreat because arrows were falling from ahead and commanders were pushing from behind, blocking withdrawal. They could only trudge forward mechanically through mud, stepping on dead and wounded comrades, waiting for the arrow that would inevitably hit them. The psychological torture was as devastating as the physical casualties mounting by the hundreds. Men watched those immediately next to them be struck down suddenly. They saw arrows protruding from bodies at grotesque angles. They knew with absolute certainty they were next in line, but military discipline and personal courage kept them moving forward, even as the formations visibly thinned. By the time the first Scottish schiltrons reached the base of the final slope up to English positions, they had lost perhaps 1/3 to 1/2 their total strength to sustained arrow fire. Thousands of Scots lay dead or wounded on the approach ground, the terrain behind the advancing formations literally carpeted with bodies. The survivors, exhausted from struggling through mud for 30 to 40 minutes, many wounded, all psychologically shattered, now had to climb the final slope and fight fresh English men-at-arms who were positioned defensively on firm ground and fighting downhill. The Scottish assault hit the English defensive lines with negligible force. Men who had just survived 30 to 40 minutes of arrow bombardment and climbed 800 yards through knee-deep mud had absolutely no energy left for effective combat. They struck the English defensive line and were repulsed almost immediately. The English men-at-arms, standing in solid formations on firm, dry ground, completely fresh, well-rested, fought with poleaxes and swords against utterly exhausted Scots who could barely lift their 12-foot pikes. The Scottish pike formations, which worked devastatingly well on flat ground against cavalry when soldiers were fresh and in tight coordinated formation, were completely useless when the men were scattered, exhausted beyond capacity, and psychologically demoralized. The English simply held their defensive ground and methodically killed Scots who struggled up to them. Meanwhile, the English archers continued shooting relentlessly into the packed masses of Scots still approaching from downhill. The arrows never stopped falling. Even when Scottish soldiers reached the English line and engaged in desperate melee combat, English archers shot into the Scottish rear ranks, killing men from behind while they tried to fight to their front. A double nightmare. The Scottish assault lasted perhaps 2 hours of continuous desperate struggle up the hill under sustained fire, then collapsed completely when exhaustion and casualties exceeded human endurance. The schiltrons broke. Men who had endured the unendurable arrow storm and reached the English lines without breaking through began to retreat in growing panic, then to run in full rout. Once the retreat started, it became unstoppable. Thousands of Scottish soldiers turned simultaneously and fled back down Halidon Hill, but retreating down a muddy slope under sustained arrow fire proved as deadly as advancing up it. English longbowmen methodically shot fleeing Scots in the back, easier targets than advancing soldiers. Men fell face first into mud and drowned, unable to rise under the weight of equipment. Others were trampled by their own fleeing comrades in the panic. The English cavalry, which Edward had deliberately held in reserve throughout the battle, now charged down the hill in coordinated pursuit of the routing Scots. This was not a pursuit for glory or honor. It was systematic, industrial slaughter. English knights rode through fleeing Scottish formations, cutting down men from behind with swords and lances. The pursuit continued for miles across the countryside. Scottish soldiers who escaped the hill were hunted systematically through the surrounding area like animals. Some fled desperately toward Berwick, others toward Scotland proper. Many were killed trying to cross the River Tweed, drowning in freezing water while wearing armor, or cut down on the muddy riverbanks while struggling to climb out. The slaughter lasted until nightfall ended visibility. By the time it finally ended, the Scottish army had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. The casualty figures at Halidon Hill are disputed among historians because different chronicles give wildly different numbers. But even the most conservative estimates indicate a catastrophic Scottish defeat of historical proportions. Contemporary English sources enthusiastically claim 14,000 Scots were killed. Modern historians consider this an exaggeration, estimating between 4,000 and 8,000 Scottish dead as more realistic. But even the conservative low estimate represents approximately half the Scottish army killed in one afternoon of sustained combat. The high estimates suggest that as many as 14,000 Scots died, meaning nearly the entire Scottish force was destroyed. Among the confirmed dead was Archibald Douglas himself, the Guardian of Scotland and military commander, who was killed during the chaotic retreat. 5 Scottish earls were killed, the nobility devastated. Hundreds of knights and nobles died. Scotland's entire military leadership class was effectively destroyed in a single afternoon. English casualties were minimal, perhaps 30 to 50 men killed total, almost all during the brief melee when exhausted Scots reached the English defensive lines. The casualty ratio was potentially 100 to 1 or even higher, making Halidon Hill one of the most lopsided military engagements in all of medieval European history. The battlefield after the fighting ended was a vision of hell that traumatized witnesses. Thousands of Scottish corpses covered the slope of Halidon Hill and the approach ground. Many bodies had multiple arrows protruding from them at various angles, evidence of the sustained bombardment. The mud was stained dark red with blood. The River Tweed was choked with bodies of men who had drowned trying to escape while wearing armor. Berwick, which the Scots had died trying to relieve, surrendered to Edward III the next day on July 20th, as the conditional surrender terms required. The strategic consequences of Halidon Hill were immediate and crushing for Scotland. The Scottish army was destroyed, the Guardian was dead, the Scottish nobility was devastated with no clear leadership. Scotland had no organized military resistance left whatsoever. Edward III imposed his puppet king Edward Balliol on Scotland and seized direct control of southern Scotland, including the crucial fortress of Berwick. The English occupation would last for years. Scotland's independence, won at such terrible cost at Bannockburn just 19 years earlier, was effectively lost again. It would take another 14 years and the outbreak of the 100 Years' War between England and France to allow Scotland to eventually expel the English and restore fragile independence. But the immediate aftermath of Halidon Hill was complete Scottish subjugation and English dominance. The battle also had broader military implications that shaped European warfare. Halidon Hill confirmed the tactical lessons of Duplin Moor and earlier battles. English longbowmen positioned on defensive terrain could systematically destroy any attacking force, regardless of numerical superiority. This tactical system, combining longbow firepower with dismounted men-at-arms, would become the foundation of English military success for the next century. 13 years after Halidon Hill, Edward III would use the exact same tactics at Crécy against the French, killing thousands of French knights with coordinated longbow fire. 82 years after Halidon Hill, Henry V would use identical tactics at Agincourt. Halidon Hill was not just a Scottish defeat. It was the confirmation of a military revolution where ranged weapons and defensive positioning trumped traditional cavalry charges and pike formations. The human cost of Halidon Hill was measured not just in thousands of dead soldiers, but in the families and communities they left devastated behind. 4,000 to 8,000 Scottish men killed meant that virtually every town and village in southern and central Scotland lost people. These were not professional soldiers, but conscripts, farmers, and townsmen who had been called to defend their country and died in mud under arrow fire, with no chance to fight back. The economic impact was severe and long-lasting because those men were also laborers whose deaths left farms untended and families impoverished. The psychological trauma affected Scotland for years afterward. Halidon Hill joined Dunbar and Falkirk in Scottish national memory as definitive proof that conventional pitched battles against England were unwinnable. This created a strategic culture of guerrilla warfare and deliberate avoidance of pitched battles that would characterize Scottish military thinking for decades. The captured and wounded Scots who survived the battle faced grim fates. Those with money for ransom were imprisoned until payment arrived. Those without ransom money were enslaved or simply executed. The English treated the survivors as rebels and traitors rather than as honorable enemies in a legitimate war. Archibald Douglas's body was recovered and buried, but many Scottish nobles died anonymously on the slope of Halidon Hill, their bodies stripped by looters and buried in unmarked mass graves. The tactical details of Halidon Hill reveal precisely why the Scottish assault was doomed from the start, with no realistic chance of success. The 800 yards of waterlogged ground at the base of the hill meant that Scottish soldiers were completely exhausted before they even reached the main slope. Medieval soldiers wearing armor, carrying weapons, and struggling through knee-deep mud would be utterly drained after covering that distance. The sustained arrow fire meant that the Scots were taking continuous massive casualties throughout the entire approach, every second under bombardment. The gentle slope of Halidon Hill meant that English archers had completely clear sight lines for the entire Scottish advance. There was no dead ground where Scots could shelter, rest, or reorganize. The height advantage meant English arrows shot downhill had greater range and kinetic impact than arrows shot uphill, giving defenders overwhelming firepower superiority. The Scottish schiltron formations, which worked well on flat ground against cavalry, were tactically useless when advancing uphill through mud under fire because the formations couldn't maintain necessary cohesion. Every single tactical factor favored the English, while Douglas had no viable tactical options to counter them except to attack anyway, and hope that Scottish numerical superiority and courage would somehow overcome English advantages. It was hope, not strategy, and it led to catastrophic losses. On the 19th of July 1333, 3,000 English longbowmen positioned on Halidon Hill systematically butchered 14,000 to 18,000 Scottish soldiers, advancing uphill through mud under sustained bombardment of 30,000 arrows per minute. 1,800,000 arrows per hour. The Scots lost approximately 4,000 to 8,000 killed, including Guardian Archibald Douglas and 5 earls, while English lost fewer than 50 men, potentially 100 to 1 casualty ratio. It was massacre, not battle, where Scottish soldiers died by hundreds with no chance to fight back, shot down by arrows while struggling through exhausting terrain. Berwick surrendered the next day. Scotland's independence won at Bannockburn was lost. Edward III proved himself tactical genius at age 20. Longbow dominance over medieval warfare was confirmed. Scotland learned that attacking uphill into mass archery was suicide. Courage, numbers, determination meant nothing against Longbow's terrain, tactical genius. Subscribe to Great History for more battles where technological superiority and defensive positioning defeated traditional valor.